Okay. So the following question is really the biggest question, and I intended to address it from the beginning because if we address this question properly, not just do we have the answer to probably the most pressing question, we also have the right approach to all further questions. So the question is, I'm not making it. I'm not managing on my monthly payments as it is. What do I do? How do I pay maaser? How do I pay maaser? So of course, we can first get carried away. Wait, what are your monthly payments? Are your monthly payments all payments that you should prioritize, let's say, before maaser? Or maybe maaser should have come a little bit earlier, meaning we're talking about getting by the day kind of payments. Of course, that comes first. There's no question. No question that comes before maaser. Does that mean you're exempt? Is another story. But there's no question certain things have to come before. Right? It says your life and somebody else's life, according to halakha, your life comes first. If you can't get by the day, there's no question your life comes first. But what if we're talking about, okay, you're not talking about survival mode, but you're talking about living on basic needs. What do I do now with maaser? So, some will say, let's say we used a scenario before, somebody's making $4,000. But his life expenses, basic life expenses, are $3,800. So $200 you give to tzedaka. Give what's left over, meaning that certainly you give. But more than that, to say that you have to give $400 and that because of that you have to prioritize and you have to eliminate some of the $3,800 and reduce it to $3,600. No, you don't have to. You don't have to. But the $200 that's left over, don't use it for a luxury, don't put it into savings, give it to maaser. That's what I would say was almost the most obvious approach. The most obvious approach is that you always give maaser when you can. Even when things are tight, you always give whatever you can. But what if, when even that you can't, what if you're, as many people are, living with higher monthly bills than their income, and they don't feel like they're living on any luxuries, so they're going into debt each month, so further go into debt for the maaser. You say, you know what, I'm in debt anyway, just give the maaser. That's, as they say, they say a poor man flies first class, right? Because he can't afford the regular class anyway, so once he's flying, already. Okay, some people have that mindset, have that lifestyle, and it doesn't bother them, it doesn't shake them. Okay, I'm in debt already, a little more debt. And that maybe is a commendable thing, maybe not. Obviously it is actually a commendable thing, so long as you have a way of paying back, so long as it's done responsibly. It means that your family is not going to lose out even more down the line in the most foreseeable way because you don't have a responsible plan of paying back. But here is, I'll say, this is the Rebbe's approach to this situation. The Rebbe says, the Torah makes it very clear. The bracha for financial security and for prosperity even is through giving maaser. Never should one take himself out of that category. Never should one say, I can't. The Torah says you can. The Torah says that you can't, and therefore the Torah exempts you. But you on your own shouldn't take yourself out of that category, because it's not just a bill that you're getting, it's a blessing that you're getting. So don't lose out on that blessing. If you're having a hard time, all the more so you need the merit of tzedaka. But practically, how do you do it? But it says practically give a portion. In one letter, we have the Rebbe advising the person, give 5%. Give 5% to tzedaka, and write down the other 5% as an obligation for the future. Because you're sure that Hashem will give His blessing, because you've committed to give the full maaser. You've actually given some of it, and you've committed to the rest. So you're sure that Hashem will give His blessing, so mark the other 5% as an obligation. In one place, the situation was even more desperate. The Rebbe says, just give 1% now, but mark the other 9% as an obligation. It means always give something, and always consider the maaser, at least the 10%, as an obligation on me.
Do we charge interest?
On me, what?
Do we charge
No,
interest?
no interest.
That would be...
Good deal.
Yeah. All right, so always never take yourself out of that category, because this is the way you're getting Hashem's bracha. It doesn't make sense otherwise. As somebody said, a guy makes a big amount. Somebody in our show told me, he says he once saw somebody making a big pledge to tzedaka. So somebody said, oh, probably he had a good year this year. He said, no, I had a bad year this year, therefore I'm making a big pledge. Right? That was the logic when you see it as just a bill and, extras. I can afford it. No, but when you realize this is the source of blessing, and the source of blessing for every person on their level. Now, is the money going to fall from the sky? Is the money going to grow in your garden? Is how exactly it's going to come? I don't know. Maybe they'll put a socialist government in place, and your situation will go up. Maybe they'll put a conservative government, and your taxes will go down. I don't know. Every person in their situation. I mean, Hashem has so many ways of controlling the world, of running the world. Somehow Hashem is going to give you His bracha. So you take that bracha, take full responsibility for it, mark it down as an obligation for when I can, and obviously pay it up as soon as you can. You don't have to worry about the interest charges, but pay it up as soon as you can, as soon as you feel you have some breathing room. Make another payment into maaser, but keep. So this is something that's very, very important, and this leads us to another thing: keeping count. How do we keep count? This is somebody who's keeping count because he's not actually making the payments. Even if I am making the payments in time, right? But how do I keep count? How important is it to keep count? So, on the one hand, it says that when calculating maaser, one shouldn't keep an exact calculation, because the Gemara says whoever is precise about how much he gives to the poor, is exact in how much he gives to the poor, not a penny more, eventually he gets there himself. Don't be so exact in your calculation of how much you offer to the poor, because that's a way of landing up in that boat. Approach to tzedaka.
You will be judged from above also.
Right.
Will give you exactly.
Will give exactly. So you're not supposed to be exact, but at the same time, it says don't just make a rough estimate of everything. Make the appropriate ways. Make an exact estimate and give a little bit more. Why is it so important to make an exact estimate? Because it says you want to say, I know that my income does not exceed X amount of dollars. I'm giving more than that. I'm giving for sure 11, 12, 13%. What's the problem? There's really, halakhically, from Torah's perspective, there's no issue. There's no halakhic issue. But in many of the Svarim that speak about the advantage and the bracha that comes from giving maaser, the bracha of giving maaser is not just to make the 10% holy, but to make your whole 90% holy. The way the bracha works is because when one takes the amount and calculates it and gives a part of it to Hashem, he's giving a part that represents the other 9 parts. So because it represents the other 9 parts, therefore the blessing of Hashem takes effect on the 9 parts as well, not just on the 10% that you gave. So therefore, it's important to make the calculation. If you want the blessing to be in effect on the other 9 parts, it's important to make the proper calculation. Make sure that what you're giving is representing the rest, not just giving loosely. As good as that is, so to say, in a character trait of just giving loosely and just giving more, but there's an extra blessing that comes from being exact. In general, they say Geld, in Yiddish there's an expression, they say Geld hat lieb as metzelten, or Geld hat lieb acheshben. Money, in Judaism, as much as Judaism likes to look at money as sort of say, don't make a whole thing out of it and just be generous, but yet in a Yiddish value is money is counted. Money is accounted for. One time, I heard a story from my uncle. This story happened with his uncle. He exchanged money with the previous Rebbe. He had laid out some money, and the previous Rebbe was paying him back for some money that he had laid out. So the previous Rebbe gave him the money, and he just put it in his pocket, my uncle's uncle. He just put it in his pocket, you're not going to count money in front of the Rebbe. Well, he doesn't travel. And anyway, has the presence of mind to think about money in front of the Rebbe. So he just put it in his pocket. He said, all right, give it back. Take it again. Count up. Count it. It says, kesef, the word kesef, money, is Rosh Hashanah. Kesef sofrim pa'amayim. Money you count twice. Money, and this is not just because of maaser. This is because of all the monetary laws that it's so easy to not be, so to say, perfectly honest. Money needs an order. So also with maaser, even though the spirit is, I want to give more, I want to be more generous, I don't want to be so calculated, but yet to get the blessing on the money that you have, it's when it goes through account. When you go through, now practically, how do you do that count? I have money coming here, and I have one paycheck comes in today, another paycheck comes in another day, or I don't have a paycheck, right? I'm getting constant flow. Every person has to figure out how they make that accounting, whether they do it once a month, whether they do it once a year, not more than one, not less, it should never be less than once a year, right? The pasuk says you should give shana shana, you should give year by year. So always you should make sure that you have a day a year that you don't let the calculation go by. That you make sure that all maaser is paid and accounted for at least once a year. Some people suggest that the time of that is now, the month of El, which is the month of calculating. Others suggest that it's before Pesach, based on Kabbalah. But either way, it's not halacha, but definitely there should be a time a year where you review, which means you probably should have more often. You probably should have more often where you are actually separating the maaser, and let's say if you have income coming in, the best way is to separate it right away. You don't have to. It's not like fruits, where you're not allowed to eat the fruits until you separate it, right? According to halacha. It's not like that. You could use the money and separate later as long as you're keeping track. As long as you're keeping reckoning, because it's not a biblical thing, but it's still a very, very important custom. So you can keep track later. So every person should try to make the calculation as often as they need, and then make a general review. Some people say, be practical, do it, the best time is when you're doing it with the CRA. When you're making your CRA review, it doesn't have to be at a specific time of the year, so this is a good time. You have charity receipts, well, keep account of all the charity that you gave that you didn't get charity receipts for, and so on, and you have all your income there, even the one that somehow is not listed on the CRA income, whatever, that's leaving for another time, those laws.
What about we give to the children learning school, going to the school?
Okay, so this is another question which I want to address before. So again, the idea is always have a cheshbon. Before I talk about that, we're talking about maaser, and we're talking about just getting by. So remember that the Talmud actually speaks about being even more generous than maaser. That optimally, one should give a chomesh, one should give a fifth. So who's that talking? Not me, right? I'm struggling figuring out if I can afford maaser. Right? The chomesh is not talking to me. So the Rebbe, in many letters, the Rebbe says that maaser is the minimum. Again, as we said, it doesn't mean you always have to actually pay it, but you always have to take an obligation of maaser and keep an account of maaser. But in many letters, the Rebbe says that there's an even stronger bracha which comes when one gives more. The more one gives, the more one gets. Somebody writes to the Rebbe He says, I'm now going into retirement. My whole life I gave. I made sure to give maaser and even more than that. He says, but now I'm going into retirement. I have to cut down a little bit. The Rebbe says, no. You tell Hashem, this is the amount that I have to give to tzedaka. I need the amount to match that. And you leave it to Hashem to figure out how He's going to get you that money. It's never advisable. Sometimes it's necessary to just actually pay more, but it's never advisable to say, I have to look to be cheaper, and I have to look in what's exempt and what's not exempt. Always take on the largest obligation you can, even if it's larger than what you can actually pay. Meaning to say, you can actually afford to pay 10%. You say, you know what, we're talking about keeping track, and this is why I'm mentioning it here. Keeping track, so you know what, keep track elsewhere. So say separately, in a notebook, or in whatever accounting software you have, or today with the electronics, whatever. Keep track, say, I really would like to give 15%. And you keep that for Hashem. Hashem should know. He's going to send you His blessing right there. He's going to get a big deposit out to tzedaka, besides for the maaser on that, but also I'm going to pay back even more on what I had. These kind of keeping a track of something that's more than what I can actually pay is a way of getting more blessing. So the Rebbe would say, I'm not going to tell you to give 20%, because the Talmud makes it optional. I'm not going to tell you, but you should definitely aim towards that direction. Right? Whatever possible, in whatever way possible. Again, even if not practical, take it as a conceptual obligation, and the more trust you have, the less conceptual it is. The more you actually trust that one day I'll be able to actually pay this. The more trust you have in Hashem, you certainly will be able to pay it one day. So everybody should really, according to the Rebbe's approach, really everybody should be not just giving and taking account of what they actually give, but also possibly keeping an account of their wishful maaser, how much they wish they could give. They wish they could give even more, and keeping track of that for when Hashem will send His blessing one day, and may it be soon. So now that we discussed that, now we're into the tuition question. Or first to address more broadly, if this is the approach, that I never look of ways of exempting myself, just sometimes practically it doesn't work. So then, similarly, this is the way we deal with each scenario. We had questions we raised already. So do I pay for the holiday seats? Do I pay to this? Do I pay to that? Now, things that are clearly charity, there's no question. No question, let's say, shul membership is not a membership. It's a donation, whatever. Anything that's a straight donation to the shul. But anything that's questionable, maybe I'm doing it because it's really an obligation on me, and maybe it's all these things.
Cancer Society.
What?
Cancer Society.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, I guess. But most questions, most practical questions, we're going to have a follow-up, because there's many, many details that I want to have a follow-up next week on. But I'm just going to give the broad application. So the broad application is, I could exempt it. It is exempt. I did fulfill my obligation, at least according to one opinion. It's not biblical. If there's two opinions, I can take the lenient approach, but I can decide, you know what? Hashem's giving me a source of blessing over here. He's giving me opportunity. He's giving me a blessing. I want to consider myself obligated even more. So I may count it as, I want to pay the 10%. I could afford to pay the 10%, but not fully. Not if I don't count all these additional parts, all these questionable parts. I'm going to count it all as part of my 10%, but whatever I count that I feel is a little questionable, keep a mark of that too. That one day I really hope to do it without any question. One day I will pay all that in a way that removes all questions, that removes all doubts. So this is another thing that the Rebbe says to take. It was actually, the Rebbe was speaking about giving money for printing svarim, for printing books of the Alter Rebbe, books that hadn't been published. And the Rebbe spoke about what a great mitzvah it is. And then the Rebbe went on a lengthy explanation explaining how one is allowed to use money from maaser. According to the Alter Rebbe's opinion, one is allowed to use money for maaser, not just for the poor. And remember, there is an opinion out there that really all money for maaser should really be for the poor, and not just for other religious purposes, because that's the prime thing. We'll get a lot more into that next week, in next week's lesson, and the ramifications of that. But, so can you use it for religious purposes? Clearly, according to the Alter Rebbe, religious purposes you could use. You could use it for maaser, no problem. It says, but somebody who wants to say, you know what, I don't want to be all calculated over here with the maaser. I want to leave 10% for the poor too. Yes, I'm going to give the money. I want to leave 10% for the poor too. It says, do it. Do it. If you're ready to do that, Hashem is going to reward you, especially if you do it with bitachon, you do it with trust in Hashem, and you give the money gladly. This is all extra merit to get Hashem's bracha, and just do it. Throw yourself into it. Say, I'm not exempting myself in secondary fashion. I'm taking first class indeed. Maybe I won't actually pay it now. I'm taking first class on credit. First class of maaser giving. So this was the Rebbe's approach. So now with tuition. Tuition is actually one question which is specifically addressed by the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, although we don't have the laws of tzedaka from the Alter Rebbe, we do have the laws of Talmud Torah, the laws of studying Torah, and he speaks about the obligation to teach your children and to send your children for a Torah education. And then the question becomes, if I have to pay, can I count money of maaser? So let's speak about what you can do. Again, bearing in mind the approach, but let's speak about what you can do, because there's no point to just be strict and just make people's life difficult when it's not working. What you can do is you can count certain portions of tuition as your maaser. Which portions? So one should divide tuition in, I would say, 3 parts for this purpose. Number 1 is tuition costs. Tuition costs that are, meaning paying the teacher. The money that's going towards paying the teacher, teaching your child. There are actually some schools which do divide it for a different reason, but they divide the tuition cost in 3 portions. Basically, they only give you a subsidy on the tuition, and then they don't give you any subsidies on food or room and board, if it's such yeshivas who have that. So in general, what you certainly have in every yeshiva, even if you don't have room and board, you have tuition and you have overhead. In other words, you have the money that's going directly to paying the teacher, and then you have the money that's going towards keeping this institution running. Right? So if one can make a calculation, how much money do I have to pay for a teacher to teach my son? Right? In some cases, it comes out cheaper, right, to hire somebody privately, especially if you can hire a group. Hire somebody privately. There's no principal. There's no infrastructure. There's no shul. There's no hall. I'm not paying all the overhead that goes into making the school, a smashing success. Hopefully, but I want my children to learn. So to say, a malamed style. So that portion, that's your obligation to Hashem to pay. So just like you can't buy a pair of tefillin with maaser money, because that's your obligation to Hashem anyway, so too, you don't pay the teacher's fee with maaser money. What you also don't pay, I'm saying what the 3rd portion would be, is food and board, if you're saving in any way. If you're keeping him in yeshiva not because you don't have the room at home, or whatever, but just simply because you want him to be in that environment, so the board part of it is spiritual. Right? But the food, you save money. When you send a kid and the kid's eating meals at home, you're saving some money. So count the money that you save on the physical expenses of the child, also count that out. But the portion that you could pay for is the overhead portion. So if one can make an estimate, one speaks to the administrator and say, tell me, could you divide my salary, explain to me why you're charging me this amount, justify it, and I understand I need to pay an overhead too, right? But if you can just give me a little clarity or a rough estimate of what I'm paying for actual Torah study, what I'm paying for physical benefit, right, or I said material benefit to the child, And then the overhead, and then I know that that overhead portion I could count for my maaser. Yeah.
The problem is as if the school shares it with you or the curriculum on the CRA, and even you could see the report of the school and they'll say how much is salaries, and how much is administration and cleaning and insurance and whatever.
Right, so you can see a
Your
percentage of where the money goes.
Salaries, many schools have different salaries, teaching salaries, administration salaries. So secretary, cleaner, executive director, whatever, separate. If that's there, then you see it right away. So you're 10,000 tuition, you right away which percentage is Hebrew teaching of my child's school. That portion you cannot, this you have to pay from your own money.
Yeah, there is a letter, okay, it's time for Meyer. There is a place where one opinion says, he says, if you're getting a subsidy, usually what that subsidy is they're steering you over the overhead cost. They're telling you, look, this is your obligation, this is basic benefits that you're benefiting from directly, whether spiritual, whether physical, you have to pay that. Usually that's the mindset of the subsidy. So whenever somebody is getting less than the full tuition, if somebody's paying full tuition, he's certainly paying a big overhead portion. If somebody's getting the subsidy, it's probably in the portion of the subsidy, that's the logic. It's in the portion of the overhead that they gave him the subsidy, and therefore the amount that you deduct from maaser would be less accordingly, because usually that's the amount. Okay, but this is a general approach. Again, more questions, I'm happy to answer.
You didn't mention
More questions, I'm happy to answer privately, and we'll answer a lot more questions next week. A lot more details, gifts, inheritance.
Oh, you didn't mention difference between boys and girls. There is difference, and boys before bar mitzvah, after bar mitzvah, there's obligation. Right?
Because practically, even though the Alter Rebbe does differentiate, but practically many of the poskim say in the framework that we're living in the system, the culture that we're living in today, and the legal, whatever, there's many factors that go into it, but basically today things are a little bit different because we have to send the children to school. I do it because I need to do it. I'm not doing it just because, even if I'm not doing it because Torah says to do it, if it's my need, if it's my personal need, I also should not count that as maaser. Again, let me go back and say, if you're not making ends meet, don't actually pay anything that you can't afford. Keep it as an obligation. Don't actually pay what you can't afford, unless you feel that your lifestyle is anyway not so calculated. So okay, I'm going to pay a little bit that I can't afford, like I gave a scenario before. But otherwise, if you have a calculation, you say, this is how life, this is what I could afford, this is what I can. Only give what you could afford actually, but keep the rest of the portion as a hopeful obligation to pay, because you're not obligated to pay when you don't have the money. That's clear. So we don't have to go into the nitty-gritty as much. Understand? You take this.
Reconciling, because we spoke for additional test and we gave example that 80% of tuition could be counted as maaser. So could we reconcile it with your opinions?
Sure, I will ask for the show that for a little bit more. Why you said that it satisfies all situations and so on, that particular answer.
Also, the Shachar made also differences between tuition for a son and tuition for a daughter.
Yes, he
Yeah.
does.
What?
He does.
Yeah.
So he makes it.
Yeah,
that's our master.
And the last question is next week when to class? Because now
You have
Then,
to teach.
What?
There's a notice.
What time is it? 8:05 next week. Let's do the class right after next. What? Unless
Just send them out and that's it.
7:30.
7:30 Thursday, same day of the week.
7:30.
So next
7:30.
week, 7:30, we'll be class 15.
Yeah.